Let's now talk about teaching IR at, well, everywhere, but at universities in particular. So a couple of years ago, actually 3 years ago, we wrote this opinion paper together with Martin de Rijke on what we should teach in information retrieval. And in this paper, we looked through conventional topics, basic topics that are covered in textbooks. I'll mention a couple of textbooks later. And we also list a number of topics, actually a very long list of topics that are new or relatively new and that are not covered well in existing textbooks, because this field is, of course, very rapidly developing nowadays. So there we draw a big picture, which I will show you on the next slide, and give a lot of references and information resources. So if you need to study a certain particular topic of information retrieval, most probably in this paper we'll find relevant references, although of course in the last 3 years more material was published, but this is still a good point of reference, so you can go and check what particularly you can read or watch, or mostly read on the topic you need. So we see information retrieval and information retrieval topics in this way. So first, there is what we call an offline phase. An offline phase is the phase where you develop your information retrieval system without running it with real users, really. So what does offline phase include? It, of course, includes getting the data. So you get the data through crawling, or through just downloading the data, then you analyze the data and you pre-process the data in a certain way, and then you index to prepare it for search or for recommendation or for any other IR application. So first, it's really about getting, processing, and preparing the data. Then what do you do with that data that you obtained? Well, you do this main thing that information retrieval does, you do ranking. So you do different types of rankings, including learning to rank, and that you can implement without having any user in your system. So this all can be done offline, meaning the system is not yet in production. So when you implemented this, you also may want to implement certain optimizations and parallelizations. This is usually outside the scope of IR teaching, but that certainly is part of IR. After that, the very, very important thing that we will actually study in detail is, of course, evaluation. So evaluation in IR is as important as ranking, because if you can't evaluate, you can't improve, of course, and evaluation is hard because you have to, you can't just evaluate whether you predict the correct label or not. You really have to evaluate the relevance, which is ambiguous and vague, as we discussed, and you have to evaluate the ranking, with dependencies and so on. So evaluation is very important. And of course, there are a number of topics that do not fit into these 4 boxes, but that might be also important. Diversification within ranking, of course, different classification, clustering tasks, peer expansion, and so on and so forth. So all these things, again, you can study and you can create, you can implement when your system is offline. It's not in production yet. And of course, there is the online phase, obviously, when you run your system, when you expose your system to users, and what can happen there. There, of course, your users start interacting with your system by submitting queries, having certain intents in mind, submitting queries over long-term sessions and tasks. So this all you can study only when you have users, when you have input from the users. Another type of input is the interaction that users perform with the result that you return. So this is the initial user interaction. They submit queries. And this is the second step interaction. When you return results, users can click or can save results or can like them, share, so on and so forth. And why do you need to study that? Because then you can use that to improve your ranking through counterfactual learning to rank, through online learning to rank, and there is a special field that's called relevance feedback there. And of course, you can use this interactions not only to improve, but also to evaluate. So you can run counterfactual and online evaluation. So these are the two phases that we see, that we formalize IR field in this way. But of course, there is the additional dimension to this. So all these topics here, including offline, online, can be studied in different scenarios. In this course, we will focus on search and retrieval, and this is the historically the most widely, most completely studied scenario. But there are many other scenarios, very old or very new, like conversational search is pretty hot right now. Well, question answering maybe a bit older, and this is of course not an exhaustive list of scenarios. So you can add more scenarios here, and you can study all of these problems for each specific scenario. There will be certain similarities, certain differences, but this is how we see the field of IR. And of course, when it comes to teaching, that's completely impossible to cover all these topics for all these scenarios. So if you want to teach IR, you will, well, unavoidably have to make choices. And I'll quickly talk about the choices we do at the University of Amsterdam, and maybe if you start teaching IR at some point, that may be helpful for you as well. So at the University of Amsterdam, we have a sequence of 3 courses. We call them IR0, IR1, IR2. And this is the bachelor course. This is the master course first year. This is the master course second year for 2-year master programs. So what do we choose to teach at the bachelor level? At the bachelor level, we mostly focused on the offline phase, mostly about text analysis and processing and storing, mostly text-based scoring. A little bit we touch on learning to rank. We study in detail offline evaluation, hypothesis testing, and we only touch again on interaction and relevance feedback, so that students know that this phase is there. And we mostly study search and retrieval. Again, recommended systems is just touched upon. So it's mostly offline phase for search and retrieval, and that's the bachelor level course. Now, if we move to the first year master course, we of course refresh certain things from the offline phase for search and retrieval. We focus on learning to rank much more, and we add semantic scoring methods like LDA, LSI. We'll talk about them later. And we add online phase to a much larger extent. So we focus on online phase much more. And in this particular course, we'll talk about interactions. While these 2 topics, there is a very good tutorial online already. I'll refer you to that. And we still do this for search and retrieval, but what we do in the end of the course, we also cover some scenarios. For example, this year we covered conversational search and recommender systems in the level of detail, so that we can show how these techniques can be applied to scenarios other than search and retrieval. That's what we do for this general first year master course, and there is a very specific second year course where we only focus on scenarios. So we assume that this is known by the students, and we let them apply that knowledge to different search scenarios.